Hello, am I on? Hello and welcome to MICE, the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo. My name is Dan Mazur. I'm co-director of MICE, and I want to thank you all for coming to this panel today. It's called Comics of Conflict, Confronting History. It's going to be a really good one. We have three great artists talking about their exciting new books and the perfect moderator for the topic as well. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor for this program, Million Year Picnic. Million Year Picnic is an independent comic shop located in Harvard Square. It's one of the two oldest comic shops in the country. I can personally attest I started buying comics there in 1975 when I was a teenager. And over the years, they've introduced a lot of people to a lot of great comics. They've also had a long and close relationship with MICE. In a normal year, they would be on the MICE exhibit floor selling a lot of books for our special guests. This year, like most comic shops, they could really use our help and support, like all comic shops, I really should say. Unlike all comic shops, this week, Million Year Picnic has had its front window smashed with a brick, not once, but twice. That's a long story. But suffice it to say, it's added expense and difficulty to an already difficult time. So they could really use our support by ordering books from them. You can order comic books, graphic novels, or prose novels, nonfiction, anything from Million Year Picnic. You can order by email or phone. It's up on the screen right now. They offer curbside pickup in Harvard Square. Free delivery in parts of the Boston area, and they will ship anywhere. So please support shops like Million Year Picnic. I also want to thank all of our arts advocates. These are major contributors who help sustain MICE, keep us going, keep us growing year after year. MICE is produced by the Boston Comics Arts Foundation. That's a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization, funds comic arts festivals, individual creators, and educational programming for the greater Boston community. If you like what we're doing, please consider making a donation today by using the donate button in this session. At the bottom of the screen, you'll also see a button labeled Ask a Question, which you can use to ask a question anytime during the session. If you want to pose a question for the panelists or vote up somebody else's question to be asked, please do so. Also join the conversation via the chat feature. Say hello, tell us where you're coming from today, and chat. Finally, we are also streaming this panel on Facebook Live on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/MICEexpo, MICEXPO.com. And this is for viewers who would like to take advantage of the automatic closed captioning feature that Facebook Live offers. And now I would like to introduce our moderator, Hilary Chute, one of the finest and most prominent comics scholars working today. She is a distinguished professor of English and art and design at Northeastern University and the author or editor of 6 books on comics. Most recently, Why Comics? From Underground to Everywhere. But I'd also like to point out one of Hilary's earlier books, Disaster Drawn, Visual Witness, Comics, and Documentary Form, which is of particular relevance to the topic of today's panel. So I really think you'll want to check that one out. She is also a comics and graphic novels columnist for the New York Times Book Review. So thank you, Hilary, and take it away.
Dan, thank you so much for that introduction. So welcome everybody to Comics of Conflict, Confronting History. I just want to add to something Dan said and mention how honored I am that this panel is sponsored by the Million Year Picnic. Dan mentioned walking by Million Year Picnic as a teenager. The Million Year Picnic has been in Harvard Square in Cambridge literally my entire life. So I grew up walking by the window, and I think it's honestly one of the central reasons that I got interested in comics. So later on, after I had written some books and I was talking to cartoonists, I was often asked, how did you first discover my work? You know, because some of it is pretty obscure. And I discovered it by browsing the shelves at Million Year Picnic. So I'm just really honored to be sponsored by them, and really honored to know Tony Davis, the owner. Okay, I'm also really honored and really excited to be moderating this panel with three really amazing creators. So in terms of the format, what I'll do now is I'll introduce each of our panelists. And as I'm introducing them, I will show a few slides from their works. And then we will just open it out for questions from me for the panelists, and then hopefully have time for Q&A at the end. So I'm doing this alphabetically, and I'm really excited then to start off by introducing Emei Burell. So Emei Burell is the creator of We Served the People, My Mother's Stories, which is published by Archaia. And this is the first English edition book of hers. A shorter version of this book was recently published in Sweden, and this is a greatly expanded edition for the English market. And you can see the beautiful cover here. So Emei is a cartoonist and an illustrator based in London, and she has twice been nominated for an Eisner Award. She has had comics published with Image Comics, The Nib, The Believer magazine, Boom Studios' Adventure Time series, and also in Ed Pisker's Hip Hop Family Tree, which is published by Fantagraphics. Emei, as she wrote me, is currently venturing into the games industry, but has dabbled a little in animation while working for the Cartoon Network. And I just wanted to show you some images from her book. This is a really lovely early page of her book with some panels at the top, as you can see, depicting her mother. The first one reads, "This is my mom. She's by far the coolest person I know." Here is a panel showing her mother taking an exam after having schooled herself for a long time in order to try to pass this exam. And here is a set of panels showing her mother unfortunately being unhappy with a work detail in which there was not actually very much work in front of the people assigned to the detail. So we'll have a chance to discuss more of this book soon. Bill Campbell is the writer behind The Day the Klan Came to Town, which will be released by PM Press in April 2021. So The Day the Klan Came to Town is illustrated by Bizan Kodabanda, as you can see there on the cover. Bill lives in Washington, D.C., where he spends his time with his family and helms the amazing Press Rosarium Publishing. He is also the author of Sunshine Patriots, my booty novel, and the anti-racism satire Coontown Killing Caper. Along with Edward Austin Hall, he co-edited the groundbreaking anthology Mothership, Tales from Afrofuturism and Beyond. And he has such an interesting bio. I had to reduce it a little bit because we're keeping these bios short at the top of an hour. But among his other projects, he also co-edited the title Stories for Chip, a tribute to Samuel R. Delaney with Nisi Shawl, and the title ABP, Artists Against Police Brutality, with Jason Rodriguez and John Jennings, for which he won a Lifetime/Pioneer Glyph Award. His Afrofuturist spaceploitation graphic novel Bad Mothers, with David Brame and Damian Duffy, was released last year in 2019. And here's a really fascinating early image from the day the Klan came to town. It's in a kind of preface to the book. Here's another fascinating page, especially in the detail in the last tier. You can see a young white child playing with a terrifying racist doll as a sort of unremarked upon detail. And here's an important image, which is an image of the actual riot that the book is about. Okay, so John Vasquez Mejias is the creator of the Puerto Rican War, the story of Puerto Rican revolutionaries fighting American colonialism in 1950, which really interestingly is described in its pages by John as a woodcut novelette. John is a public school art teacher and artist who lives in the Bronx. He is also the creator of the always evolving handmade zine Paping, among other works, and really fascinatingly, recently created a theatrical version of his work, The Puerto Rican War, with live action and puppets. So I hope I'll have a chance to ask him about that in addition to this amazing woodcut novelette. So some images from this work. This is a beautiful image. Again, I'm really interested in talking in just a few minutes, hopefully, about what it was like to do this as a woodcut work. So we can see a little detail here in this image. This is a dramatic and I think beautiful early page of the work in which one of the revolutionaries comes home and reports we're going to kill the president at home. And this is another beautiful page, although a much more violent page in which we can see, you know, guns going off, and it has such a beautiful page composition and such interesting sound effects in addition to the really like amazingly articulated images of this violent fight. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, and we're just going to open it out to questions among the panelists. So it's not always so great to go in alphabetical order. It can be a little bit stultifying for a panel, but because we're on Zoom and not necessarily seeing the same order of people, let's just answer this first question in alphabetical order, if you don't mind. And for any others, please feel free to just jump in. But I was hoping that each of you could explain the historical event at the center of your book. So, you know, it's interesting to me that you have different ways, each of you, of describing what your work is. So, Bill, you call yours a historical graphic novel. John, as I mentioned, you call yours a woodcut novelette. Emei, yours is framed as My Mother's Stories. So a kind of testimony that you illustrate of your mother's. But each of you is doing a work that is based on a real historical event. So for the audience members who might not know, I'd just like to ask each of you to describe that historical event at the center of your book, and then how you came to create comics about it.
Okay, I guess I'll start then. So We Serve the People, My Mother's Stories centers around the Cultural Revolution that took place in China between 1966 and 1976. So it was a decade-long revolution where millions of lives were lost, and a whole generation of young people and kids, their life changed kind of forever. So I'm honing in on a specific part of the Cultural Revolution, which is called the Down to the Countryside and Up to the Mountains movement, which my mother was part of. So It was a movement started by Mao Zedong in 1966 or 67, where all schooling from first grade to university was interrupted. All the students were basically either sent home or they came to school and just spent their days doing nothing. And he wanted a reschooling of educated urban youth in rural areas of remote rural areas in China. So from all the major cities, anybody above the age of 14, I think, was sent to the countryside around China to be re-educated, live and work and learn from farmers. So she was 17 when she left for the south of China to work at a rubber plantation. And once there, she was stuck there for 10 years until she was around, 27, basically. And China had at the time and still has this domestic passport system, which means that it kind of prohibits rural to urban immigration, which means that if you come from the countryside, it's almost impossible for you to move into the city, but the other way around is extremely easy. So for these like thousands and thousands of students who were sent out to the countryside, it basically meant that they could never go home. Fortunately, when the revolution ended, they changed this, and the students who wanted to go home could then travel back to their hometowns. So yeah, that's the main central event.
So then, just to follow up with the second part of my question for everybody, how did you come to create comics about it?
For me, these are stories that my mother has told me since forever. She was always telling me and my brother about her time in Beijing when the Cultural Revolution started, her years in Yunnan, the south of China, working in the jungle basically, and then how she really wanted to leave China and move to either the States or Sweden. So these are stories I've heard since forever, and I thought if I find them this interesting, maybe somebody else will also.
Great, thank you. Bill?
Well, the day the Klan came to town is about the day the Klan came to town. So like that's literally the historical event. What ended up happening was this is 1923, when the Klan was a national organization.
Okay, and I should just say quickly, this is in Carnegie. So do you want to say
Carnegie? We're actually kind of anal about that.
Okay. I like to be corrected.
No. It's a Pittsburgh thing. It's like one of those things. Like
okay, but so
yeah. All right, so here we go.
Came to town where? If you could just describe that a little bit.
All right. So anyway, so the Klan was a national organization by this time, and they were moving into Pennsylvania. So what they decided was Carnegie, PA, which is a small suburb outside of Pittsburgh, which is a coal mining town. Like basically the whole town is built over a coal mine with some steel mills. So it's a town full of European names that you can neither spell nor pronounce. And heavily Catholic. So it was like the perfect place for the Klan to go. So they decided to hold this thing called Carnegie Day. And the town had about 3,000 occupants, and they marched 30,000 Klansmen on the town. So at the end of Carnegie Day, they decided to go down this one street that had two Catholic churches on it, one German Catholic and then one Irish Catholic. And that part of town, which was called Irish Town, stood up against them. So they think estimates vary, but they think somewhere on that block were about 10,000 to 25,000 Klans people marched down the street, and probably maybe like 1,000 people from all around the town met to face off against them. So while the Klan was heavily armed, they had, they were using cobblestones, they were using pieces of coal, their hands, just fencing, just anything they could. And they ultimately killed a Klansman on the steps of, ironically, which was later to be my church. And how this, so it's just so how this came about was last Easter, we were hanging with my mom for Easter, and my brother and I were just talking about the hidden history of Pittsburgh, like all the things they don't tell you when you're growing up. So we were talking about when the city burned down, and the Denora poison gas incident that killed like 14 people in an afternoon. And then my brother was like, oh yeah, like the Klan riot in Carnegie. And I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, I grew up there and nobody ever said anything about it. So, after that, oddly enough, about a month and a half later, I was driving, I had to drive around Carnegie. I was coming back from a TCAF in Toronto, going home. And I was driving around Carnegie, and then the main character on my way around the town, the main character, his whole story just popped into my head. So then I was just like, I guess I'm going to write this story. And it's a fictionalized version of it, because not a lot of people have written about it. There are like a couple of chapters in Monogram here and there, but there's not much actually written about the story itself. So we know about the politicians' actions during the riot. We know about the Klan's actions during the riot, but all the people who were there, nobody talked. So it was kind of like we had to piece together, like through census data and stuff like that, like who was in the town, who was likely to actually meet up with them, and all that other kind of stuff.
That's such interesting context. I'm just wondering, I mean, the fact that you grew up and you didn't hear about it is so fascinating. Why do you think that was the case, that it wasn't something people talked about?
Because they all became white. So they don't want to talk about in the 1920s how they weren't white and that they were they were victims of the Klan,
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. So, they were I mean, the people were alive, because I moved there in 1978. So there would have been people who were alive and their kids would have known about it. But basically, I even talked to people I went to school with. They're like, yeah, like one person out of all the people I went to school with, like, yeah, my parents talked about it, but nobody talked about it. And I think that's just the case. To use like a very recent example, Mike Ditka is on talking about, love it or leave it, my country, and he's like been giving all these pressers. Well, the funny thing about Mike Ditka is his last name is actually Druska, and he's actually from Carnegie. So his parents were in Carnegie being told to leave the country by the Klan, but he turns around now that he's white and changed his name, like he can go ahead and say that. And I think that has a large part to do with it.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Well, it's like once you're in the club, you want to never act like you were never a member.
Right. Okay, I hope we can continue to talk about this. John, I'd love to hear what you have to say about explaining the historical event and then how you came to do this work about it.
Sure. My book, The Puerto Rican War, in 1950 in Puerto Rico, it was illegal to own a Puerto Rican flag. It was illegal to speak about independence. It was illegal to sing a patriotic tune because Puerto Rico was and still is a colony of America. So Pedro Albizu Campos attempted an uprising. They took over 2 towns. They sent 2 men to America to try to kill President Truman. They were not successful, but it's a story that I always heard in my family, that my father always would tell me. But in school, not 2 words about Puerto Rico in school. Very Eurocentric. And so I just for years would just complain. Nobody knows the story about Puerto Rico. Somebody should say this story. And one day my father said to me, well, you're somebody. So I made a book about it.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a question we don't have to go in rigid alphabetical order, although if we happen to do that, that's fine. But everybody feel free to just jump in. I've loved hearing about how you came to the circumstance of doing comics about these moments in history, or movements in history, or important events in history, uprisings. But I'm wondering if you had any ideas about why comics is a good medium to tell these particular kinds of stories. Any thoughts about that?
That's hard to answer because it's my medium. It's something that I've been doing since I was 8 years old. So it's just who I am.
Right.
Maybe if I was a filmmaker, I would have made a film about it. But I was making superhero comics at 8 years old. It's just part of my being. So when I want to make something about Puerto Rico to tell the story the best way I can, this is corny, comics are just in my blood like that.
I don't think that's corny. I like that as a response. Well, it's interesting to think about superhero comics and some of your really kinetic pages, like the one I showed, showing these fights, these violent fights. Any thoughts from anybody else about sort of why comics, why this form for these stories?
Well, for me, because I used to write novels, so for me, I think probably brevity on my end, because like the main character is Sicilian, so I had to do a lot of research. But like if I had written a novel, I would have gone so deep into the woods of like Sicily, Greece, like just like all those places, and 5 years later I might have written a novel. So that was probably part of it. And then the other part was I thought, wow, like a riot would really be fun for the artist.
To draw.
Yeah, like yeah. I just thought, like, man, if I were an artist, I would totally want to draw like all this stuff. So that was pretty much it, like the war scenes and all that stuff. That's where. So it was like brevity and like fun for the artist, I thought.
Interesting. Okay, Emei, do you have any thoughts there?
I very much agree with John. Like it was the medium that felt right for me, because comics was or is what I do. Like I'm doing some other things now, so in the future I might consider how would this work as like a game or like a choose your adventure text thing. But at the moment where I was working with it, comics was the medium that I was working with constantly every day, and it just felt right. And personally, I hate crowd scenes. So I would be like, there are some parts where there are a lot of people in the panels, and I was like, okay, this is gonna take me 3 days, but all right, let's draw this train station in Beijing. Let's just draw 1,000 people. Yeah, it's probably just like what felt right at that moment. And yeah, if I was a filmmaker, I would make a movie instead, and just
Well, so that's interesting that people have mentioned on one hand novels as a potential other form and film as a potential other form. Let me just try something on that struck me reading all of these works together and has been interesting to me thinking about history, and especially to harken back to our title, comics of conflict. It struck me in all of your works that there's an interesting dynamic for a reader between what gets shown and what doesn't get shown. And this particularly can be the case in some scenes that are violent. I'm thinking, John in your work and Bill in your work. So, Bill, in The Day the Klan Came to Town, I was so struck by some of those visual details that go unremarked upon in the text, like the one I mentioned of the racist black doll that a little white girl is holding. It's a very upsetting, small detail in the frame. It reoccurs. Or, sometimes there's just blood that's splattered that you can see on the white Klansman robes, but you don't necessarily know how that blood got there, right? It's outside of the frame. And so it struck me reading this work about this historical event that it can be very dramatic in comics form in terms of what it doesn't show, but asks you to think about. John, I found the same thing in your work, especially with some of those more violent scenes, the sort of fight scenes. So I was wondering if people had any thoughts about showing violence or not showing violence.
Okay, I'll let you in on a little secret that I used to draw when I was a kid. I actually went to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh back when I was a teenager. So yeah, at one point I did want to draw, but like being with a whole bunch of people who drew like much better than me, I was like, I'm pretty good at writing too. So like a lot of this credit goes to Bijan, but his art style, and I thought he was like perfect for this project. And it was a very collaborative process, so a lot of that goes to him. But I think as a writer, that the best writing is left off the page.
Yes. Yep.
That you can say a lot in the silences.
Yep.
So like, especially with that girl, so like you're thinking of the image, but just not explaining it is much more effective, and not commenting on it just shows you just how commonplace that image is or was at the time.
Yeah, and I think that would be hard to do in a prose-only work, like a conventional novel, right? So
in that instance, you would do it differently, but yeah.
Yeah, interesting. John, do you have any thoughts about that for the Puerto Rican War?
I sure do. I struggled a lot with including violence in my book because I'm more of a Martin Luther King Gandhi kind of guy, and the ghost of Gandhi appears in the book. So the violence is a little tongue-in-cheek in some spots, like, is this really the best idea? So I do go a little over the top in some places with the sound effects. There's a couple of tongue-in-cheek remarks about violence in the book. Yeah.
And I should say you have a funny note in the back of the book apologizing or asking indulgence for imagining the ghost of Gandhi and the Irish revolutionary Michael Collins in their appearances in your work.
Yeah, because I'm adding in some fiction, so I felt bad.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you made about the tone being sort of tongue-in-cheek in some of those scenes. So Emei, I was wondering, thinking about your book, which doesn't have a lot of pictured physical violence in it, although it is about suffering and about persevering in a totalitarian regime. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the use of photographs in your book, because, thinking about the comics form of your book and this being a work of sort of you translating your mother's testimony for comics form, it's so interesting to get the contrast between your drawings of her and then in some cases, the sort of matching photographs of her in the same era. And so I was wondering why you incorporated photographs and sort of what your thinking was in using two different media, drawing and photography, in the book.
Yeah, that part was actually super heavily influenced by the book Alan's War. I can't remember who drew it. I love his work though. And I remember the effect it had on me when I read that book, and coming to the last 10 pages and just seeing all these old photographs of this man from serving during World War II. And there was just something that made it feel more tangible and real, I remember. Like how this whole story that in some senses, even though like it felt so real, it could have been fiction, but then seeing those photos just made it super real. So I kind of wanted to pay homage to that and use that same trick of just tying reality closer to the comics medium, even though like it is based off her life and it is a biography. And then part of it is also, I used so many of those photos as my own research. I used a lot of like books from that period of time that had a bunch of photos just to try and make it feel as real as possible. Like also for my mother, like I think one of the best comments I got from her was like, this looked exactly like the road I drove down. And then it felt very successful for myself. I was like, okay, I managed to be there with you in some kind of way. So I really like that.
That's so interesting, because it seems to me that one of the things you're saying in terms of one of the reasons that you decided to sort of add photographs to the surface of the page is that in a way you're showing your research process to your mother and to readers at the same time that you're also more straightforwardly telling your mother's story. Because it's so interesting, you know, you have panels that are drawn, you have panels that are clearly drawn and based on photographs, like the two panels at the top of the first page of yours that I showed seem clearly like drawings based on a photograph because she's posing in them.
Yeah.
And then you have actual photographs. So you have all of these different layers, and in a way it shows the work that you did to try to get the details right, which is an interesting thing that you do, making that part of the story.
Yeah, that's, I've never seen it like that myself, but yeah, in a way that is like the parts of it, because some parts I also have like massive amounts of text and just one drawing. So it's almost like from script to parts research to like full-fledged comic. It was very enjoyable working like that.
I'm glad it was enjoyable. You know, you often hear about like the toil and the suffering that goes into this kind of research and page construction. So speaking of that, I wanted to ask John about something that strikes me as so moving and so amazing about your book, which is the woodcut form of it. Could you talk a little bit, maybe for people who don't know about woodcut, about the kind of labor that goes into making even one page of a woodcut narrative?
Sure. It'll kill your shoulders and make your fingers numb.
Yeah, a lot of labor.
I've been a printmaker since the early 90s. I took a class in it, and it just really clicked with me, just the way you start off with everything black and you're taking away as you're carving. I also would just really draw really thick and chunky, so when it came to the wood, it just came out thick and chunky the way I drew. So I always tell people, like, I can carve wood better than I can draw. So just through the years, if you look at my old zines, I'm wood carving more and more and more. Although this is the first book I'd ever done the text. However, for this book, the wood blocks.
Example.
Yeah. I didn't do everything backwards. I carved the wood, and that was the final art object. So everything's forward. Here's a page of that. So everything's forward facing. So I never printed it. I just scanned the blocks, and that made it into the book.
Wow, interesting.
But I worked on it for 6 years, this book.
Wow. I mean, one can really tell looking at the book, the incredible amount of craft and labor that went into it. It's such a beautiful object. So, I mean, I know that you're also a teacher and you have other art projects. Could you just describe how long it took you to work average on one page?
Usually my routine is get home from teaching, eat dinner. It's about 6 o'clock, and then work until 9 or 10 o'clock. I think if I didn't have the teaching job, I could have made the book in 2 years. But my teaching job is super important to me. It's sometimes more important than my personal art.
And in terms of any aesthetic influences, are you interested in people like Lind Ward and other people who did, you know, so-called wordless novels or woodcut novels in the 20s and 30s?
Definitely. Lind Ward is way too tight and technical for me. I'm very loose.
Interesting.
But you look at the German Expressionists, and of course Franz Masseril, and you mix that with Kirby, and then you mix that with Vejagante masks and African masks, and you've got what I'm doing.
Interesting. One of the things I loved about your book is also the beautiful patterning and the ornamentation, even on pages that are really loose and show, for example, fight scenes. I mean, you could see it a little bit in the page I showed in which the revolutionary is coming home and telling his wife about the plan to shoot the president. You know, on the right-hand corner, you know, there's a picture of the coffee press, and it's in some ways ornamental. Do you have any influences in terms of that aspect of your book? Because it's such a beautiful feature of the work.
I hate it when artists use the word organic, but I'm going to use it now. It just more and more organically just crept its way in to a point where I'm always looking at patterns all the time and taking pictures on my phone. And I just kind of love sitting there and the idea of, like, I'm going to make this pattern for an hour. This is a pattern I printed on my wall behind me.
It's gorgeous.
Just organically kept its way into my work, you know, like it's my version of a halftone.
I like that answer. And I have to say, this is the second time you've apologized for saying something that potentially sounds cliche. And one of the things I love about cliches is that they're cliches because, you know, they're true. So I'm glad you said that, you know, the comics were in your blood and it was organic to be drawn to these patterns. So thank you for that. Bill, I wanted to ask you, but this is also a question for everybody, and I'm hoping everyone will weigh in. I wanted to ask you about the timeliness of your book. So, I mean, sadly, on its face, it seems timely right now in this moment. But also, and I think unlike in Emei and John's work, you make an explicit connection with the present and historical events in the present. There's a sort of penultimate page that is a reference, well, an explicit reference to ICE, and shows, I think she's a woman, a young woman saying, "I was born here." So an explicit reference to historical, devastating historical trends of today. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that moment in your book, and for the whole panel, if you have any thoughts about the timeliness of your work, whether that's intended or not intended, thinking about it now.
Well, I think that I've discovered, you know, being a science fiction writer and publisher and a dilettante history nerd is, if you're dealing with historical subjects, you're pretty much, sooner or later, you're going to be timely.
Yeah.
You know, I remember UT Dallas was teaching one of my books, Sunshine Patriots, back in 2016. And they were like, "Oh my goodness, this is so today and this is so relevant." And I wrote it back in 1998, you know. That's just kind of the way things are. As far as this book in particular, I'm half immigrant, as I like to say. My dad's from Jamaica. My mom's American. So all the immigrant rhetoric kind of rubs me the wrong way. And, you know, being half African American, sometimes you just feel attacked on a daily basis. But, you know, when my brother told me that story, it just, like, I had to write it because there were so many people that I went to, like, high school and grade school with who are very pro-Trump, but they have last names that you can neither spell nor pronounce. So I was just like, look, we need to stop the myth that immigrants built this country, because they didn't. The country was built 200 years before they even got here. And we also have to stop acting like we're just welcome immigrants. Like, we've never welcomed immigrants. I read once that Ben Franklin complained about the swarthy Swedes coming into this country. So it's like, one, even Swedish people weren't white at one point, which just is funny.
Even if you weren't from a shithole country.
Yeah, you know, and just the thing that struck me about making the protagonist a Sicilian was just like what happened in Sicily and Italy that brought all these Sicilians here just so reflects how so many people come to this country. Like they're fleeing political violence and corruption and just these really horrible conditions. And it's just like Sicily in 1890 is, you know, much of the world during the Cold War, and that's why people come here or came here. So it was just it was pretty much like too on the nose not to do it.
Right.
It's like a fly in Mike Pence's hair. You kind of had to swat at it.
I like that. I like that analogy.
Yeah. So that was pretty much it. It just had to be written. Like people just have to know because people like to forget.
Yep. Anybody else?
I don't really know if I have like a good reply to the question. I know that, like, obviously not intended to have it my book coincide with, like, you know, the commerce war on China and like all the political things that are happening right now. But hopefully, like, there's a lot of things that have happened in that country that even me having one parent from there know very little about. And if this can ignite a spark to look into more things, I'm just super happy. Like, if it can make people interested in finding more out about this history, or like, I'm sure like any of the other histories and other books in this panel as well, like, to make people interested is most useful, because the more people know about these things, the more they have like an actual educated view on it. So
I think that's a really important point. John, do you have anything to add?
No, I think she said that beautifully. Yeah.
Well, I would love to continue to ask all of you questions about your works, but since we have less than 15 minutes left in our panel, I think I should open it up to questions from the audience. So I guess I will turn it over to Dan, who is going to vocalize any questions that we might have in the queue.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. The most highly voted question on our list is from Neil Rideau. We're living through a number of notable historical moments and movements right now. Are there events happening now or in the recent past that you would be interested in making a comic about?
for me, it would be the Hong Kong protests that happened, but I feel like it's still not resolved. So I want to wait and see what happens there.
Such an interesting answer. Yeah, I wonder when we are going to see comics about those protests in Hong Kong.
I think I did. I mean, it was like, because I mean, like the Klan was like totally my response to what's going on now. But I mean, I think that it's kind of hard to say because hot takes are wrong. So if you're gonna write about anything that's happening now, like I wouldn't feel comfortable writing about like even like the 2016 election until probably about 2 years from now. Do you know what I mean? Like you need that space to contemplate and just to see where things fall out, to have like an educated take on what's happening to you.
I just want to point out, Bill, that's such an interesting point. So across your three works, they focus on events happening in 1923, 1950, and the 1960s and 70s. So all of you have sort of many decades that have intervened since what you're drawing and writing about actually happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for us, I mean, like, or for like my particular work, you know, the 1920s are very much the 2020s. I mean, we're talking about massive immigration, we're talking about demographic shifts, and we're talking about definitions of race, right? Because like the funny thing is, you know, the Klan's rhetoric never changed, just the targets have shifted a little. So they were still when they were talking about all these different European ethnic groups, they were still talking about white supremacy. So it is very much a comment on what's happening today, and it kind of shows where things can kind of go, where some people may ultimately be admitted into whiteness, but like black people never can be.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so like that's not something that's tenable for what's happening now. So yeah, I mean, when I look at the past, I think I'm looking at the present or possible futures.
Unfortunately, right. John, should we head to the next question, or did you have an answer to that?
I'm going to make a story about Puerto Rico today, but it's going to be quite a few years before it happens. Things are happening a lot right now with the aftermath of the hurricane, and there's more and more people that want independence for Puerto Rico. There's some people that want statehood. So there's a book coming about that as well.
I'm really eager to see it. I'll hold my breath for a few years. Dan, we have time for a few more questions. What might be next?
There, gotta unmute. Yeah, there's a couple more really good questions. Here is one from Megan R. What research did you do? And at points, did you feel it was essential to be true to your research? And where did you divert? Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I can call John out on this one, just because, you know, John, you have this great, you know, references for further reading section in the back.
Yeah, which actually my sister yelled at me one day. She's like, "You better list your sources. Like, people are gonna, because so many people never heard of this, they're gonna wonder." But American Gunfight was a book that I reference, War Against All Puerto Ricans, and a good friend of the family, Dr. Basilio, was a professor of Puerto Rican studies. So I had a bunch of conversations with him where he directed me. And then I made a huge list of bullet points and went from there.
You know, because of Rosarium and that we do the whole multicultural and own voices thing, for me, it was very important to get the main character and like the whole Sicilian and Italian thing right. So I read a ton of stuff about that because I just wanted to get it right. In fact, Italian American friend of mine was just like, "You have all these funny spellings," and I was like, because I wanted to make everything that they said Sicilian. Like I really wanted to get those kinds of things right. As I said, there wasn't a lot written about the people who fought against the Klan in it, so I had a bit of leeway there. The one part that I really diverged on was there's a Chinese American character named George Washington Lee. He actually was a historical person who lived in Carnegie at the time, but he was 9 years old. But I couldn't pass up that name because it's like so quintessentially immigrant, right? You just I had to like put him in there. But other than that, like I tried to stay as true as possible because I just don't want to get burned.
Yeah, it was kind of simpler for me, I guess, in one sense, because whenever I needed to know more, I could just ask my mother to describe the place or the event more clearly. I could just make another recording of like an interview I had with her. I could ask her for a photo reference. I could ask her and my stepfather to like see if they could find on like the Chinese internet photo resources where I wasn't sure where to even start looking because I didn't know the names and stuff. But I think more important to than the visuals for me, it was really important to keep the tone of how she told the stories. I really wanted to keep her voice in how she told the stories, because that was what captured me when I heard them for the first time. So it was like quite a bit of work to try and translate that from Chinese to English, and then try and keep all the like language things, like the little, how everybody's like uncle or old lady, and how a lot of people are a big brother or big sister, but it just sounds different, obviously, in Chinese, and it can be very confusing when you do a very strict translation of that. But it was a little bit of a give and take, and like, how does this actually read and make sense, and how do I keep it very similar to exactly how she told it and how she made the story come alive.
Interesting. Thank you. Dan, we have time for maybe one or two more.
Okay, yeah, this is a really good question. It kind of overlaps with the last one a little, from Miranda Nimmer. What is
one
the
of my
hardest
students.
part?
Thank you, Miranda.
Yeah, you were referenced in this question. What is the hardest part about writing a story that is not your own, but representative of another person or people? In Hillary's class, we recently read Mouse, and in the book, Art Spiegelman goes over his own struggles in writing his father's story and trying to empathize with an experience he did not have himself.
I'm going to have to say, this story is my own. This story is my people, Puerto Ricans, and my family, which is what helped me for 6 years to carve this thing, is to know that I'm representing Puerto Ricans and I need to do a really good job. But it's a very personal story for me.
I guess I'll go. For me, it was as I said, it was very touchy for me. There were definitely areas of overlap because, you know, I grew up in that town, and as I said, like the immigrant story, like I do know that because it's part of my family. That I didn't know those specifics was touchy, but that I grew up with a lot of Italians in my neighborhoods and my schools and stuff. So like I was very keen on making sure that when representing something that's not yours, that you try to basically everybody's human. So like you approach it as a human as opposed to like some kind of story phenotype or stereotype. So there were things that I knew, and then I knew that I didn't know most of it, and that any kind of thing that I would think of automatically was wrong. So it was just sort of like trying to wipe away all those Godfather movies or whatever it is you wanted, Once Upon a Time, and all those away, and think back to the people that you knew growing up, and then going like, how do I want to be treated? And I think that was the approach. Like, how would I want to be? How would I want this story to be told if it were me? And just kind of push it that way.
I found it really, really difficult. First of all, to make something that wasn't too long, because there's so many more stories from what's contained in the book. But also me and my mother had very different opinions on, like, there were some parts that I felt was very vital to the story and would have shown the society very differently, but that she was very stuck on, this does not go into the book. And it's like respecting, like, this is her story. I can't do anything that she doesn't want to be in there. But there are some subjects that are still too sensitive that she feels, that I have way more vocal opinions on. And that's just a generational and upbringing difference. But I found that, like, separating my own voice from hers and then respecting the original story. But in the end, it is like what Bill and John said, like, it's a human story and you just gotta respect it for what it is.
Thank you. So we're at 3 o'clock now. So I think, unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but I urge everybody to obviously check out all three of the works. And I want to turn it again to Dan for some final comments.
Thank you, Hillary and everybody. That was really a great discussion. And thanks for everyone who came to attend today. As Hillary said, you really are going to want to read all three of these books. These are three of the best comics, graphic novels that I read this year. To order them from Paper Asylum, another local independent comic shop deserving of support, you can find links on our website by clicking the button on your screen. This session is part of the Month of Mice, a month of free comics programming, including panels and workshops. And if you're interested in this topic, you really won't want to miss a very special panel we're presenting called Remembering John Lewis, a conversation with Andrew Aden and Nate Powell, who are Congressman Lewis's collaborators on the March graphic novel series. And they'll be joined by cartoonist Joel Christian Gill and WBUR reporter Quincy Walters for a discussion on both the making of March and the ongoing relevance of the principles that Congressman Lewis spent his life fighting for. So that is this Thursday night at 7 o'clock. For a complete list of the remaining programming and sessions, visit miceexpo.org, MICEXPO.org, and also check out our fundraising raffle, where you can win cool prizes like a tote bag of books from Drawn and Quarterly, a mice sketchbook, or a Wacom One tablet, Wacom One tablet. Now stay tuned to watch our Creator Showcase, a virtual exhibition floor where you can watch dozens of independent comics artists showing and telling you about their brand new self-published comics. Thanks, everybody.